Bienvenidas, bienvenidos.
Welcome everyone to this second session of this cycle on the global crisis of supplies that has been organized by La Casa Encendida together with the Foundation Transición Verde. Before we dig in, I just wanted to remind you that we will have some final minutes for questions, because I'm sure that you will have questions, so you can simply write them down on the chat, and in the end our guests will be reading your questions and answering them. This global crisis of supplies is present in our conversations, in the newspapers, in the news. The consequences of the pandemic, the invasion of the Ukraine have deepened these crises that has gone from being something circumstantial to something that we have to think of in the long term. And if we add to that the prices of energy, or the fact that factories have stopped manufacturing fertilizers and so on, this obviously will be a real supply crisis. We closed last session by asking whether the capitalist model had reached this end, something that Muriel and Heinberg were agreed on. So the model is clear, and obviously we have to think. Richard said that we needed to think out of the box, and we needed to find alternatives that are appropriate to and pertinent, relevant to the circumstances, but it's not easy. And with this landscape, how do we answer to the situation? So now we have a conversation around the post-growth with Yayo Herrero, who is an anthropologist. She's a technical engineer. She is a social educator, a professor, an activist. She's our ecofeminist. For many of us, she's our reference. She has worked with Ecologists in Action. Currently, she is also a teacher at the UNED for the UNESCO Cátedra, and she's an author of many different books that I really recommend, such as The Life in the Center. And together with her, we have Tim Jackson, who is an economist, an ecologist, a writer, the director, I'm sorry, going to say this in English, the director of the Research for Sustainable Energy, I think she said, and it's about sustainability. And Tim has been for 30 years being at the avant-garde in the discourse for sustainability, collaborating with bodies such as the UN, the European Commission. I don't know to what extent they actually listen to him. He will let us know. And since 2018, he is the Commissioner for Agriculture, and he is the author of many different books that I also recommend, amongst them Prosperity Without Growth, and his last book is Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, and he's also a teacher for sustainable development in Surrey. And the best thing that I can do right now is to shut up and give Yayo the floor so that she can initiate this wonderful conversation that I'm sure is going to enlighten us all. Well, good afternoon everyone. And the first thing that I would like to do is thank Transición Verde for having organized this meeting and for having allowed me to have the great pleasure of talking to Tim and to all of you, to all the people who are connected here today. I also wanted to thank La Casa Encendida. It's always a space where we gather, where we unite, and it is a pleasure to be here again. And in order to start digging in, I have read Tim's last book. I had also read Prosperity Without Growth. And to be honest, I always thought that his books were very, very suggestive. And I've always felt represented in the work that he carries out. And I wanted to thank, as we've finished, or as I am sure Antonio Turel and Heinberg ended the previous session, I wanted to talk actually about something that he also tackles in his book, which is this idea, this myth of growth. Because I think that the myth of growth, and I think that I share that with him, as he says in his book, is at the heart of all the problems that we're currently facing. It is a myth. It is an almost religious stand. I think that capitalism right now is really a civil religion that bases this religion on the myth of growth. And I think that this is a dangerous religion that makes people believe, makes half for most of people believe, that it is really worth sacrificing everything as long as economy will grow. And if that's all right with you, Tim, then maybe we could start talking about this myth of growth, how you see it, how you usually work on it, and how we should tackle it so that we can actually reach that post-growth society.
Sure. Thank you, Yayo. And thank you to the Green Transition Network also for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's the end of a day of teaching for me. I've just come from a class of students, and it's a real testament to the appetite that there is for change, just how engaged this group of young people has been in the subject of post-growth and of ecological economics for the last 3 days, and they'll go on being, I hope, for the next 2 days as well. Some of them may be listening in. I did advertise that we were holding this session now. And it's a particular pleasure really to be doing this with you, Yayo, because I had the pleasure of looking at your book in my not very good Spanish reading, because it's not yet translated into English. But the one thing that I found and really loved about it was the poetry, that it is a very, the last book I'm talking about, which I translated for myself at any rate as Absences and Losses. And it's a really beautiful book, and to me, the way that it approaches the subject matter, it isn't so direct as saying that it's a myth of growth in some nasty way that we have to offset, but that it is somehow embedded in our culture. It's embedded in our cultural conversations, and it's embedded in the way that we see the world. And I think you and I probably agree that what has to change is the way that we see that world. It isn't necessarily a purely technological task that we're talking about in terms of transitions of supply chains. And it isn't even an economics task entirely. There's a sense in which when you talk about myth, that is a cultural phenomenon. And there's also a sense in which every culture has its own myths or sets of myths. And these myths are important because they provide cultural guides. They point us in the direction of progress. They highlight the areas of danger, or at least they should do. And they direct us in our search for a better life. And I feel, certainly from your perspective as an anthropologist, that I wouldn't expect you to disagree with that really. But I think that for me, the difficulty is that when you're embedded in a myth, you become culturally blind to it. So that our language appropriates that myth, and our ways of thinking appropriate that myth, and our social norms appropriate that myth, so that very soon we're all talking in terms of progress as growth almost naturally. And we even appropriate the metaphors from nature that growth is good. You know, we want our kids to grow, we want our plants to grow, we want our crops to grow, and we appropriate the goodness of that phenomenon of growth in nature in order to support and legitimize the concept of growth in our economy. And of course, to me, what is obvious and to some extent tragic about that, and I would be really interested in your thoughts on this, is that it is essentially kind of half a myth. The myth of growth fails in a sense because it doesn't adopt the other part of nature, which is actually a process of stabilization and of collaboration between organisms and ecosystems, and ultimately, of course, and we don't like to think about this, processes of decay and degrowth. And it's therefore hard for a culture that has appropriated a myth that progress is all about growth to really begin to internalize some of the other half of the myth, if you like. If the fault of the myth of growth is not that it praises growth or sees growth as being something useful at certain stages in the life cycle of beings, but that it sees the entirety of social progress in terms of growth, and that it solidifies that growth in economic terms. And those economic terms have, as we know, created the material impacts on the planet that are now proving to be unsustainable, not just in environmental ways, but in social ways too.
Bueno, yo comparto mucho lo que estás diciendo. Efectivamente, yo creo que no estamos solamente ante un problema
Just facing a technological problem or a simply economical problem with regards to what we consider economy to be, like a subsystem that is separated from others. But basically, we have a problem which is a material problem, but that is also a cultural problem. I think that in order to overcome this logic of growth, the damaging one that destroys ecosystems and that destroys human lives and non-human lives, we mainly need to dispute the cultural hegemony and the political hegemony that arises from this cultural hegemonies. So I, yes, very much think that the problem of the myth of growth is that it has been coined on over a very small part of the reality, because as a matter of fact, our society wants for economy to grow, and the conventional economy has been configured as a reduction of what economy could be, because economy could also be the way in which people interact between them or with nature to guarantee the needs of all to be covered. But right now, the economy has been reduced to production, to basically that which has to do with money, the growth of money. And this is an economy that, from my point of view, is completely disconnected from the earth, but it's also completely disconnected from human needs. I really liked from your book when you talked about the fact that one of the main pillars of capitalism is actually set on the creation of a lack of well-being, of constant lack of well-being. It is necessary for people to constantly feel unhappy and unprotected to feed this dynamic of growth, of spending, of consumption. So we might find that the economy is no longer fulfilling its function, the function of supplying goods and services to guarantee the satisfaction of our needs. And it now becomes a will of making economy grow, even if in this economic growth process we're not satisfying the needs of all human beings, and we're actually destroying the earth while doing so. So I think that it really has a lot to do with myths. And I think that Western culture also has a sort of original sin that we need to review, because in the Western world, the human culture, the concept of progress and the birth of economy, and even at the beginning of science, it was created by ignoring and losing sight of the unavoidable relationships of eco-dependence that the human species have, and also the relationships between different human beings. So together with the myth of growth, there was an anthropological assumption, an idea that the notion of person is someone who has as a purpose to live completely free from nature and its limits, to live independent from other people, and even independent from its own body. And we know that that is only possible for some individuals who are privileged, who usually were men, male, white men, who are at the cusp of the trophic economic pyramid, and that requires for the exploitation of white territories, the exploitation of other beings, of women, and it also required colonization and racism against part of the society. So over that fantasy of individualism, we have another myth which I believe we also have to work on, this idea that people one by one are not viable, that we have to be part of societies that collaborate and cooperate amongst them, and that also interact with a nature that has physical limits. So I think that together with the growth myth, I think that this notion, I called it, well, this configuration of human beings as though we were extraterrestrials, as though we had learned to look at Earth from without, from the superiority, and a complete instrumentalization, is also something that we need to change. We need to work towards a prosperous society, but not from the logic of a growth that is not viable.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, I do think we're slightly in danger of agreeing with each other too much. So we need to find some way that we can disagree with each other, so that we're not simply saying the same thing. But I mean, I really liked in absences and losses, your metaphor of a society trying to escape from gravity, from the gravity of the earth, and it's a very telling metaphor at the moment. And in fact, it's something that I've written about myself in the terms of this, what we could call the billionaire space race. You know, very rich people turning their monetary resources to escaping from planet Earth, at least for a few lucky people who may be able to afford it, in the hope that there's something better outside of this Earth. And of course, it's something that the social philosopher Hannah Arendt commented on several decades ago in a book called The Human Condition, where she was at that time watching, I think it was the first Soyuz space mission, and the excitement that came with that idea that we could finally escape from planet Earth, as though that were a goal in and of itself. And of course, we've seen a renewal of that in this billionaire space race with Musk and Bezos and Richard Branson vying with each other, essentially, to become, you know, the first millionaire billionaires in space, and to create the impression that our salvation lies outside the planet. And I think the way that I think about that, apart from its folly, because it is clearly a folly, is that it is a sort of extension of the idea, an internalization of the idea that growth is our only salvation, and that the obvious way to keep that growth going, in fact, the only way to keep that growth going, really, once we've used up all the resources and trashed the atmosphere on planet Earth, is to try and find something better out in space. And I remember watching a program, an interview. It was an interview with the TED curator, Chris Anderton, and he was interviewing Elon Musk. And somewhere in the middle, when Musk was talking about the space race and his part in that space race, and Chris said to him something like, what is it that motivates you to do all these amazing things? And he was almost flattering of Musk throughout the interview, actually. And Musk just thought for a moment, and he said, you know, all I really want to do is to be able to wake up in the morning and not feel sad. And it was a sort of extraordinary insight into the psychology of escaping from problems, running away from problems. And it's the same psychology, I think, that's embedded in the turn towards consumerism. And you referred to my discussion of that sense in which what consumerism is not an attempt to satisfy us at all, actually, from the perspective of the economy. It's an attempt to dissatisfy us, so that we will keep on buying more things in the hope that they will satisfy us. And so consumerism itself becomes a kind of escape from our realities. And that same sense of psychological insecurity that we're not turning around and looking at, that we're not addressing as human beings. And instead, in order to avoid being sad in the morning, we go out and we shop, or we go out and we create enormous enterprises, or we go out and become extremely rich, or we go out and we have billions of dollars of financial funding put into a space program to allow us to escape into the outer atmosphere. And I don't want us to spend the whole time sort of psychoanalyzing that myth of growth, because I think it would be really interesting to turn towards some of your other, you know, suggestions that of the things that we've left behind in our makeup, and even perhaps to articulate what a better myth would be, a different myth would be, and how we would want to construct that. But I think it's really fascinating to start from that perspective of that understanding that there's something that motivates the myth of growth that is deep in our psyche and speaks to a kind of insecurity in us.
Sí, vamos, totalmente.
I completely agree with with trying to start thinking about what could be alternative myths, I in the book actually the concept of prosperity that you mention, I think that it's a road or a path that we need to explore and that we need to take into account. It's an alternative concept for prosperity. And also in your book, you say something that actually resonated within me, because I had also been thinking about that, which is everything that we have been living during the pandemic, during this coronavirus pandemic. It's also true that during this pandemic, we have lived situations that could have been unheard. I mean, could have not sounded realistic. What politician would have dared propose a lockdown or to really let the economy go and have them completely fall? I think that there is something interesting. You said that it was a window of opportunity. And at a certain point during the beginning of the pandemic, I did say that it was like having the possibility of having a minute of clarity. And to me, it was very significant to see how a great part of the world's population did accept, even if they were not willingly doing it, but they accepted extreme measures because they were absolutely aware of the fact that what was at risk was all of life, the life of their loved ones, their own life, and many other people's lives, and that was the priority. And during the pandemic, I don't know if it has been the case where you live, but close to where I am, what we have seen and what we have lived has been a great community explosion. Many people have actually taken the streets to cooperate, to organize themselves, to help other people who were having a harder time than them. And I think that is really the basis, the foundations that will allow us to defend the fact that there is a possibility to create myths, utopias, and narratives that are completely alternative and that could be based on an idea of sufficiency, of having something that's sufficient, of being prudent, of being cautious, of caring, that could maybe reach all the people and the earth as well. And I think that in that sense, we could continue digging, and we could be hopeful that when people are aware that they're putting fundamental things at risk, things that are fundamental to sustain life, they can understand and they can become protagonists for important changes. I don't know how you see that.
Yeah, I do absolutely agree. I mean, from what I took from that pandemic situation and what ended up, interestingly, in the book, because I started writing the book just before the pandemic and then had to go back and rewrite quite a lot of it when we found ourselves in a different world. But actually, in the process of rewriting, I was in a place where I had never expected to be, where, as you say, there was an almost universal recognition, at least at certain points in the pandemic, that the foundation for our prosperity is not wealth, but health. And that vital distinction points us in a very different direction. It points us, I think, towards a different kind of myth, so that instead of a myth of growth, we need to think in terms of a myth of balance, because ultimately it is balance which determines good health, a balance between having too little and too much, a balance between the genders, a balance between the young and the old, a balance between our demands in life, our mental satisfactions and our physical satisfactions. And one of my biggest complaints, if you like, about capitalism is that it completely fails to recognize where that point of balance lies. And so it's unable to stop when we get there. And we push continually beyond that point of balance in all sorts of ways, between our work and our leisure time, between having stuff and having relationships. And so that sense to me that the pandemic, that moment in time, gave us an insight into the nature of prosperity, that I'm hopeful that it can bring bring us towards this different kind of myth that we can articulate prosperity in terms of balance rather than in terms of growth. And of course, when you think about prosperity as health rather than as growth, it transforms how you think about the economy as being something that continually expands, and it instead makes you think about the economy as an arena of care, because care is what you need in order to ensure and maintain and nurture health in society. And of course, that, you know, at one level, that's a literal phenomenon. When health was at stake, it was the carers in our lives who made it possible for some continuation of life, and sometimes literally saving lives. And they were the people who had been left behind by capitalism, whose livelihoods were insufficient, whose working conditions were almost intolerable at times and got worse during the pandemic, and whose status was sometimes amongst the lowest in society. So, and it was a moment of reckoning for capitalism, it seems to me, because if we don't take that message seriously coming out of the pandemic, then we have no chance of avoiding that sort of calamity in the future. And we've no chance of reaching this transition to net zero and to material sufficiency. But it also, to me, speaks of, you know, a moral challenge. And I'm very aware, and you mentioned it before, and I want to come back to it, that there is a gendered nature to that moral challenge. But the moral challenge of actually creating a care economy, it seems to me, lies at the heart of how we need to be approaching this transition at this point in time.
Sí, yo estoy completamente de acuerdo, seguimos estando
I
de acuerdo.
completely agree. Yes, I know, we still agree. But I think that when we had to define what were the essential professions, we also had an opportunity to open up spaces for debate, and these were debates that had been closed too early politically in some places, but at least they were open. And it's something that you also talk about in your book, which is the notion of work. Under the logic of growth, work is everything that is done in exchange of a salary. And under the logic that establishes life, good life, prosperous life as a priority, work is that which will contribute to sustain those lives. And what we find is that cleaners, people who work in elderly homes, people who worked in hospitals, obviously, but also let's not forget that the women who work in their homes with their families, who are not even called workers, were the ones who, in greater measure, were the ones to take on the load of the health crisis, because most people who were sick were not going to hospitals. So it's obvious that there is a condition that is completely gendered, that has a gender bias that is quite obvious. Of all the things
esencial fue el de los transportes.
Sustain life, and we actually have to say that another sector that revealed itself as essential was that of lorry drivers and transport workers, which is a masculine profession that has also been punished, because this bulimic capitalism is forcing for a decline in resources and fossil fuels and so on, that have put those workers in a greater precariousness. This is a system that has been built in transportation. And I would like to go back to those ideas that could become a myth. And I was saying that the idea of prosperity, I believe, is a very good idea. And the idea of health that you also developed in your book is also very important. I have to recognize that during the pandemic, it was thanks to some books that have been written that I have been able to dig deeper into the concept of holistic health, a concept of health that involves every individual body, but also the whole society and nature. And I think that is a key axis as well. And I think that we should also talk about what we deal with in the ecofeminist forums, which is the concept of sustaining life, because sustainability traditionally has been very much used, and it has been its shape has changed depending on what they wanted to say, and we never talked about what it was that we needed to sustain when we talked about sustainability. And we can sustain anything, but what needs to be sustained right now is life, and climate change is not going to end with life in the planet. But what is clear is that human beings at this pace of climate change will not survive. So this idea of sustaining lives, that calls to the fact that human life cannot be sustained on its own. We need to sustain it. The society needs to sustain it, and the idea of placing sustainability of lives at the center in good conditions, prosperous conditions, healthy conditions, is also something I believe that can be considered as an idea we could work on.
Yep.
An idea we could go back to. I don't know if you know, but I'm sure you do know, of Kay Raidward's book, The Donut Economy. I think that she talks about an environmental ceiling that we need to take into account, and a minimum within. So those two thresholds, the minimum and the maximum thresholds, holds a space where we can build prosperous, safe life, sustainable life for all human beings and other species. And I think that too could be a journey or a road that could give us instruments to rethink our way of living together.
Yes, thank you. I mean, yes, that idea of an environmental ceiling and a social floor, I think, directs us to that point of sustaining well-being in an environmentally sustainable way, and thinking of prosperity in terms of health. I think one of the interesting things about health is when you start to assess health, you need more than one indicator. So you don't, you can't measure even human well-being just by looking at the amount of calorie intake that you have. It has to be the right kinds of calories in the right proportions, has the right mineral and vitamin content. You have to drink as well as eat. You have to breathe first and foremost. And actually your ability to do these things as an organism is a very complex function which has evolved over millennia within the mammalian species, and then of course within humanity, in order to allow us to live. And I think it's another of those places where you realize the paucity of capitalism and economic growth under capitalism, and an economic system that sees itself as being able to measure success through one simple but very, very flawed indicator of money. It's almost like, you take the richness of life and you collapse it down until it has the form of a dollar or a euro or a yen. And it's clearly, it's almost, when you think of it in those terms, it almost feels like as a society, we stopped growing up because we were looking for such simplistic solutions to what progress is, and settled so easily for one which simply doesn't have enough indicators. There's not enough information in the pursuit of the GDP, for example, to tell you anything about inequality in society, anything about the well-being of the poorest in society, anything about our individual mental health, anything about the health of the environment. And actually going back in a way to an idea that society is itself an organism, a complex organism, in which you cannot hope to guide it by the pursuit of one simple, single, linear, and hopefully exponentially rising number, such as the GDP. And I'm sort of fascinated. I'm fascinated by where some of those ideas came from. And I think that figuring out where they came from to some extent might help us in figuring out how to evade it. And that was quite a lot of what I was doing in post-growth, was sort of trying to deconstruct these various things using sometimes other people's work, like the philosopher Hannah Arendt that I talked about before. And her deconstruction of work is really, really fascinating, because she divides work. And I don't know if this works in Spanish as a metaphor, but in English, they're two very different words. One is work and the other is labor. And for Hannah Arendt, labor is much of what I think feminist economics would call reproductive work. It is that part of work that sustains life, and that actually is often and almost completely undervalued in capitalism, and is exactly the work of all of those people who are undervalued under capitalism. And so capitalism, to some extent, wants to push labor under the carpet, into the corner, out of the light. It's not interested in labor at all. And then she characterizes work as being what happens when we look up from the toil of labor, when our labors are done and we have sustenance for the day, and we've looked after the people that we look after, and we look up. And she makes a really interesting point, that when we look up from the exhaustion of labor, as she describes it, the first thing we see in the spare time that's available to us is our own mortality. And so our next step from that recognition of our mortality is to create something permanent in the world. And that creation of something permanent in the world is what she calls work, the creation of artifacts, the creation of memories, the creation of buildings and institutions, and the durable world that helps us to not feel that fear of death that comes once our labors have finished, and to begin to believe in a durable world that goes on past us. And that project, of course, is a very human project. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of having some sense of a strategy to deal with our own mortality. But when you look at it through a capitalist lens, a really strange thing becomes evident, which is that durability is inimical to capitalism. Capitalism cannot stand durability, because if things last, then there's no guarantee or reason for replacing them. And so what capitalism tries to do is it tries to create a disposable world, because that's the world in which you can guarantee that you're always going to need to make more things and sell more things, and people are always going to need to want to buy them, particularly if you dissatisfy them along the way. So and the casualty of that process under capitalism is durability. That's the first casualty of capitalism's rushing towards disposability, if you like. And another casualty of that failure to think about the reason that we work, that reason of creating a durable world that lasts, is that work itself becomes meaningless. So essentially, as human beings, we end up participating in a society in which we're either doing the grunt work and have no status whatsoever, or we're chasing after this other world where we're trying to create durability and systematically finding that it's undermined as we do it. And our value in society as participants in society is much, much poorer as a result. And so, if you take those two things, the denigration of labor and the denigration of work, the meaninglessness of work under capitalism, if we were looking for solutions, and I think this is where particularly ecofeminism and feminist economics generally has put forward so many good answers in relation to taking care of the task of reproduction, in valuing the people who work in that sector, in valuing what was unpaid in society, and protecting the work which, as you've pointed out, is mostly done by women in society, and putting greater value on that. The other task that I think we need to set alongside that is a task that rehabilitates the function of work as Hannah Arendt saw it, that function of building a social world which has meaning and permanence and relevance. And in doing that, gives us back the fulfillment of work. Because like you know, I see the casualties of the world of labor, not just as those as women who are working in tasks which are unrewarded in society, but also of men who have lost a sense of fulfillment and purpose, have no way of sensing how they should be in the world, and without in any sense wanting to apologize either for being male and white myself, or for the miscreants that has been created, the ill will that's been created by mainly male white rich elites across the world. It does seem to me that a part of the transition is as much about rescuing those people from that myth as it is about creating value for those who have been left behind under capitalism. And the world, you know, that could be richer as a result is one in which we all feel that we have a fulfilling place in a meaningful world, and our work is a genuine contribution to the durability of society.
Sí, bueno, muchísimas cosas has planteado.
Yes, lots of things. You have put lots of things on the table, and all of them are really very important. So I'll try and try and link them. So you said something at the beginning when we talked about durability and when you talked about that lack of recognition to mortality as well. I think that capitalism, and that is one of the things that from my point of view needs to be worked on so that we can recompose those broken bonds, cultural bonds that have been broken with the earth and with other people. I think that there is something that we need to recognize. We need to recognize that capitalism is an anthropology, a model that has actually decided to act against the limits, and it uses, or it has created a narrative of limits that is really dangerous. And I think it is a problem to confuse limits with scarcity. Scarcity is a concept that is a political concept. Something will become scarce when it is not prudent to use it, when it is being used in an exaggerated way, but it wouldn't need to be scarce in a world of sufficiency and prudence. But capitalism, as you very well said, rejects durability. It rejects everything that makes things last, because the degradation and the destruction of everything, this creative destruction, as some theoretical authors called it, is actually the basis for economic growth. And I also think that they're at war. It's not really that they're at war, but they're silencing and hiding mortality and vulnerability of each life. And when I talk about vulnerability, I am referring to the recognition that each human being is a being that needs food, that needs care, that needs water, that needs housing, that needs capacity, influence, and to have some sort of meaning. The only human being who doesn't have needs is the one that is dead. But capitalism, by reducing all of its rationality to what can be accounted for, is ignoring and not seeing the vulnerability and the needs that have to be always satisfied. And what has happened is that an important part of that satisfaction, that the satisfaction of those needs, has been relayed, has been hidden, and has been assigned to women of that labor. Here, women who work at home and housekeepers, when they don't have a job outside of their home, when they tell them, what do? They say, no, I don't work. What I do is my labor, my tasks, because those are their tasks to sustain the world. So giving visibility and putting those tasks, those labors at the center, because they're the ones sustaining life, and shedding some light on the existence of limits is something that is crucial to better understand ourselves as people, to better understand what we are, and in order to adopt a policy and an economy that can protect us all, that can protect us with dignity. But obviously, what happens, and you said it, and I completely agree, in feminist economy, what we have seen, and well, actually from ecofeminism, I'd say, is that for production to happen from a capitalistic point of view, there is a previous condition, which is the production of life. And that cannot be done with a logic of capitalism. It cannot be measured with money. And no matter how much money you have, you cannot make it better. A woman, usually it's women, a woman who works caring for an elderly person cannot, does not consider that it is more productive to go walking as fast as they can down the street with that senior citizen. No, what's productive is just to have a stroll, to go for a stroll with that person. So there is an idea of productivity that is alternative. It's completely different to the idea of productivity that we developed in the capitalist logic. So I think that there is a capacity, there's a possibility of reformulating the notion of production, the notion of growth, because there will be things that need to grow, such as relations and the time that's available for those, that work that you were mentioning, which is that of durability, the work that allows us to create things that last, that give meaning to life. But then there are other things that need to degrow, because they will degrow whether they like it or not. So I think there is a possibility of thinking of alternative ideas. And I really like the way you talk about work, because sometimes even in some alternative movements, they think about work as something that should disappear to dignify human beings. But in reality, work is the capacity of being. If you don't work, there is no production of food. With no care work, there is no durability of life. Without work, there is no community, there is no politics. So our life depends, in a sense, of a work that clearly has to be given a new definition. It cannot just be employment or any job. I'm thinking of David Graeber, for instance, when he talks about the concept of shitty jobs, when he's referring to jobs that are very well paid. And those who do those jobs, they know deep within them that they're worthless and that they create great social sadness, great sadness to those who do them, even for those who do them. Although from outside they could be thought of as successful people. And also another concept that you worked on, and I also noted it down and I underlined it because I thought it was important, was to work with the idea of innovation. What should be innovated, what should be changed, and what should be preserved? Because I think that in a capitalist model where everything needs to be constantly destroyed to generate wealth, and war is a very good example, and that needs to be rebuilt to generate wealth, we are always building and rebuilding so that we can generate wealth. The idea of preserving things, you know, that populist movements from the far right also call themselves conservative parties that conserves. But actually we have to conserve things. We need to preserve natural balance that will allow for life to happen, even if we don't want to conserve or preserve patriarchal societies, unfair societies, and so on. But I think that we should maybe think deeply about what needs to be innovated, what needs to be revolutionized, and what needs to be preserved. I think that that is also very important. We need to talk about that, and it would allow, I think, to overcome some terms that are usually assigned to this or that social sector, and that could maybe be a meeting point. I mean, I have been living in a little village, in a rural area, in a very small village, and it hasn't been the case for a very long time. But I see that some people say that they are from a conservative side of politics, but in the end, their logic really connects with my logic. So we might not be in agreement with other things, but with many we are. And with regards to the meaning of life, I think that we have the same vision. And I think that we need to create the narrative for that to change.
Yeah, I agree. There are so many points that we could talk about. And the point about limits, which I think is, very well made. The way that I see that is that I see what we've not really done properly is to distinguish between what is limited and what is limitless. And there are things in society that are limitless. Our ability to help each other, the strength of our relationships, our ingenuity, our spirit of innovation, our dreams for the future, our dreams for our children, our aspirations for the good life, our creativity, our ability to imagine. And yet, what I think happens in the limits debate is that the limitless aspect of our ingenuity is misused as a way of denying our material limits. And I think that's the wrong way around. The way that I've talked about that in post-growth is actually completely the opposite, to argue that by accepting limits, that enables us to see the difference between our material world and our aspirations, our creative world, our spiritual world, the world of our relationships. And so the limits essentially become the gateway to the limitless. It's by recognizing limits that we reach a place where our lives and our world of work and our society can actually be a richer and more fulfilling place. So I really like that kind of bringing limits back into focus. There's one thing, Yayo, that I'd really like to explore with you, because to me it's something very unresolved, and I'm not entirely sure that it's resolved even in feminist economics. I've written, certainly in some authors I would say that it is, but it's a question, and I would be really interested in your take on this, is if we accept that capitalism is a patriarchal system that we are still living in, and that is still dominating how we look at value in society, is still undervaluing women, is still privileging at least some men, although by all means not all of them. And from my question, I guess, is to you as an anthropologist, can we look at a time in which, or a society in which that wasn't the case, and can we see actually the pathways, can we see the conditions of those societies as a way of thinking about how we transition out of that patriarchal model and into something which then, because it is valuing women and valuing women's work more highly, also values prosperity as health, also values the work of care, also values the protection of the environment. And I just wondered, if you can see, or if from your anthropological perspective, you can see the temporary nature of patriarchy in the same way that we've been trying to look at the temporary nature of capitalism as just a phase in history.
Bueno, yo, a ver, a mí me resultó muy interesante la lectura del libro El Cáliz.
I thought that reading the book, The Chalice and the Sword by Ryan Ashler was very interesting. And basically what she said was that the birth of the patriarchy took place around 5,000, 6,000 years ago, at a moment where precisely men who were no longer rooted in the territory, who left the territory, who who were no longer connected to their community, to their territory, they initiated this dynamic that would transform the world into a more violent world, and it will end in certain societies, such as, for instance, the Greek society, old societies, such as, for instance, the Messianic society. These are societies that were not matriarchies. They were not matriarchies. What she says is that these were societies where there was a greater equality. She doesn't say that it was a matriarchy. It's not as though women were privileged in society. They did not have a privileged position. It was rather societies where the care for life, connection with nature, and knowing that sustaining the society was key. So her theory is that from that moment onwards, society has always been fighting between these moments of violence where communities were disconnected to the territories and to the communities, and that would be a violent patriarchy. And then there are other moments when we are recovering, especially when there are great crises, cooperation dynamics. So I really like the work that Rebecca Solnit has done in Heavens in Hell, because what she did was study what happened in some great disasters. I mean, what she did was talk about big disasters during the last century in the Anglo-Saxon world. And what she says is that if we analyze what happened after those big disasters, exactly right after it happened, although the logic or the dominant discourse would lead to war, to violence, to having everyone fight everyone, in the end what happened was that cooperation dynamics would have woken up and people would have been mutually aiding each other, cooperation to sustain life. And in these movements there were men and women involved, so all people were involved in sustaining life. So I think that the patriarchy dynamic, which is very much rooted, deeply rooted in our society, and that has found its weapon in capitalism, I think that capitalism could not take place in a society that was not a patriarchy, because it needs to exploit all of that labor that is done in an invisible way. But that logic that, as you very well explained previously, is not privileging all men, not at all, but it does establish a series of categories where we seem to see that some lives are worth more than others. I mean, people more than every other life beings, white people more than black people, men's lives more than women's lives, rich people's lives more than poor people's lives. So this model suffers, and certain points where it has been destabilized during history, for instance, during revolutions and big transitions. So there is a constant battle, we could say. And at certain times, men realize that the capitalistic dynamic is also hurting them, because for them it's a constant requirement. They have to be powerful. They constantly have to be successful. They constantly have to be constantly unhappy, unsatisfied when comparing themselves to other men. And the narrative that is being pushed towards us from the power stances is, don't worry if you're not happy, don't worry if you don't have a satisfying work, because you will always have a status of power over your wife, over migrants who have come from other countries. And that's what it uses to sustain itself. It's an extremely violent system that doesn't make happy most of the people who live in it. And I think that right now the references that we could look at, because going back to societies is going way back, but I think that if we look at those moments of crisis, those crossing points, those points where there was a disaster, those points where there was extreme cooperation going on, I think that those are small labs. These are moments when there was a disaster, and now civil society is also building a lot in the social and solid economy, energy, cooperatives for agroecology, for instance. There are people who are creating experience laboratories that are not capitalistic, that are against the patriarchy, that try not to be ecocides, that are anti-racist, and that in many cases are also joyful, and they're also filled with hope. And I think that there is a possibility there if we look at that. And we who work creating theories, we could establish those models that could be scalable, that could be translated into greater dynamics. But I think that in a hidden way, in an underground way, and sometimes even being persecuted by the state, paradoxically, there are thousands of people who are already setting up these alternative constructions, and who are trying through their own practice to design and to look at new horizons that could be compatible with the physical limits of the earth that we have already overcome. So I do think that we have imperfect mirrors to look at ourselves. I know that these are mirrors that are imperfect, that need to be finished, but we can look at our reflection in those mirrors.
Thank you for that. I mean, the implication. I really like Rihanna Isa's work. I think I'm very attracted by that idea and by the way that she characterizes the different cultures of domination versus partnership, and partnership as a kind of different model. And it's very fundamental in a way. It's speaking to what appears to be, in the same way that the myth of growth is a hardwired part of our culture, it's challenging a kind of myth of the division between the genders that of course feminist economics has also challenged over quite a long time, but it's also it's offering a kind of opportunity, or at least it's offering historical precedents for a different way of organizing society, and of different relationships between the sexes, and of different patterns of relationship and interaction that are not based around domination and violence. And I really like that. And I have to, of course, as a white male in a relatively rich country, in a privileged job in a university, a part of the challenge for someone like me is actually to accept that I'm slightly on the wrong side of history, or perhaps a long way on the wrong side of history. And the difficulty with that, of course, is that at the individual level, I can do as much work as it's possible for an individual to do to understand that my own, if you like, my own responsibility as a part of a patriarchal society, and the advantages that I've gained as a man living in the patriarchal society. As an individual, I think that's a really interesting challenge, not one that can be necessarily attempted without a degree of therapy, I would say, but it is something that at the individual level you can do. But I wonder, I think that we're now living at an incredibly interesting point of time in relation to this, as we're talking about these ideas, and we're talking about prosperity as health, and we're talking about the role of care. We've been thrust into the reality of a kind of awful violence. And that awful violence, I remember I listened to another woman sociologist, I can't remember, from the LSE, and she was talking on the radio a day or so after Russia had invaded Ukraine, and talking about the motivations, in particular the motivations of Putin in ordering that invasion. And she was talking about it in terms of toxic masculinity, a concept of masculinity itself as being toxic. And it's a concept that I've heard also in relation to the leadership of Trump, the leadership in the UK, particularly around Brexit, a sense of privilege which comes from your ability to profit from being in a patriarchal society, and is deeply inimical to change. It's something that, it's something we are now being faced with, the reality of the power of toxic masculinity prosecuted through war from a country that is basically within a country that's basically being destroyed piece by piece in a long war of attrition. And of course, we can talk about the energy resource implications of that and how it would have been much better if we hadn't been reliant on those resources to talk about the resource crisis. That's one way to talk about it. But there's another way that I think is deeply challenging to talk about, because we have to come to terms, I think, with the idea that transition that you and I would like to see towards a more caring society, towards a care economy, towards prosperity as health, towards a partnership model rather than a domination model, is currently being trashed by something almost its extreme opposite. And I find that very challenging. I mean, I like to think of it as a cathartic moment, that in reaching the nemesis of the idea of care, we actually have a possibility to reclaim that idea of care. But I would be very interested in your feelings about that, and also in your feelings about, in particular, the differential roles of men and women in that process and their differential positions and responsibilities for it.
Bueno, yo comparto,
por ejemplo, la de Putin. I completely share that Putin is toxic masculinity, as is Bolsonaro's or is Donald Trump's masculinity, or as is Salvini's toxic masculinity. I think that these are toxic masculinities in the sense that they really represent all the poles of dominion. But with regards to the responsibility of having to work on it, I think that I am a woman, but I also have to constantly check my privileges, because when certain colleagues who are of the Rom community who have told us, well, you're a feminist, but you're white, but you also have a whole system of racism and privilege within you. And the first time that they tell you that, it kind of itches and it even hurts. But then when you look within, you have to recognize that it is true. And that the fact that we live in a world that is based on a logic of dominion, and since it is a logic of dominion, it is violent, and that it hides everything else, that it puts other lives in a situation of risk, there is a certain responsibility. I think that any person who wants to contribute to generating a society that will sustain prosperous life, privilege, it becomes a responsibility, a greater responsibility, because from that place of privilege, you have to review the situation, you have to understand your responsibilities. And I think it is key. And I think that from that position, if we understand that the subjects within the patriarchy society is an individual that thinks that is free from the limits of the planet and that does not need to care for his body or anybody else's body, then in the end, that individual that is a subject of patriarchy, that is usually men, but that can also be found in other bodies, I think is the one that will in the end generate a way of understanding science, technology, and a way of understanding production and understanding money that is still something that is above the materiality of the earth and bodies and cannot take care of them. So in that, if we land in the earth and the bodies, that's when we can change things, and we need to land in that. It's our challenge. It's a beautiful challenge. It's quite motivating because we have to recover a dynamic which would be that of vital sense, and we have to do it with others. I think that, to me, the most important thing right now, the key is to not be alone in this task the task of rethinking, reconstructing these alternative worlds, because not being alone allows you to even laugh at your fears and laugh at your failures and experiment and to taste the success of collective power and doing things in common. And it's not just masculinities, but also that those white toxic supremacy and toxic human species supremacy is what we need to fight against. And that obviously generates pain, it generates tension and violence and conflict. That's true. So the fight here, or the path to prosperity, to holistic health, to sustaining life, also involves unavoidably some conflict, or a lot of conflict in some cases. And we have to be ready for that conflict. We have to be able to face that conflict and work that conflict. And I saw that Carolina turned her camera on, but I hadn't looked at my watch, but maybe it is time for the Q&A session. Isn't that right, Carolina? Well, yes, actually, we would spend the whole evening listening to all of you because it's always very interesting. I always thought, what would the world be like if women could really hold power, if there were more prime minister women or president women, if we would have the same result. But I would like to interrupt you, humbly interrupt you, and ask you a series of questions, because there are lots of comments on the chat, lots of exchange going on in the chat. They have been talking about the possible solutions, about how we could build this post-growth. But I wanted to ask you some of the questions that I have read on the chat. For instance, do you think that there is no limit for wealth? That would be one of the questions. I'm going to just ask a couple or three questions, and I would also like you to keep one final minute for one last turn so that you could answer to a question. Do you think that neoliberalism reached its end? They're saying that from a political standpoint, it seemed that certain discourses, certain narratives are saying that neoliberalism is reaching its end. Why do you think that environmental awareness is a minority, really? If we're heading to a collapse, why people don't realize that we need to be aware of the situation? Why do politicians not say things clearly? Are they getting us all ready to build another model? I don't know. And you also were talking about how we cooperate, and they were asking me, how can we promote those ways of cooperation? How can we coordinate that cooperation, and how can we also think about those other alternative solutions? And the last question I'm going to ask you, I mean, I don't need you to answer to all of them, but just answer to some of them. If you were to wake up in the morning and you were a political leader, what would you do? What would you do to be able to materialize all of these theories? What would be the measures that you would put in place? What would be the first measure you would put in place so that we could start the transition we've been talking about?
Si quieres comenzar, Tim, por ejemplo.
If you want to start, Tim.
No, I want Yayo to start.
Perfecto.
I mean, yes, thank you everyone for that list of questions. They're great. I mean, some of them, just to take a few of them, I suppose. You know, one of the things I mentioned at the beginning, you know, I've been teaching a class this week, and it's quite extraordinary when you place the frame clearly enough around the problems and lead people to them. It's quite extraordinary how quickly even people who haven't been accustomed to those ideas before can see through towards solutions that, you know, I as a ecological economist and Yayo as a feminist economist and many other people have been talking about for decades. And yet it's possible for, you know, people in the class to come up with and to understand and to offer solutions to some of those problems in the matter of of a few hours, or at most a few days. And that always puzzles me as a teacher, that I can bring people to that point, and the work of others can bring them to that point where they can understand the logic of it. And yet the changes are so resisted in our society. And I think, one of the other, that brings me to one of the other questions that was asked, why do politicians not say things clearly? What is going on there in the politics of power? Why are we misled by politicians? Why are they resistant to things that clearly need to happen when the logic is actually profoundly simple in many cases to understand? And there, I do think to some extent we're led back to the question of power and what power is and how it's articulated in our societies and how our political systems do or don't regulate power in appropriate ways. And it was one of the themes that I looked at in post-growth, in particular, because these arguments quite often come back to politics and power, and why politics doesn't exercise its power to change things in ways which would make sense. And I think I did a couple of things in that exploration of power. One of them was to go right back to the roots of political democracy and ask what the philosophers who were laying down the foundations of democracy were trying to achieve, and how they were trying to achieve it, and looking and seeing right in those early foundations of political democracy a kind of caveat, a clause which says that when your elected representatives no longer represent your interests legitimately as a people, or fail to represent the interests of the poorest in society, their legitimacy as a form of political democracy is gone. And that the only response in those terms actually is forms of civil disobedience. And so you can go back to the earliest philosophers and you can find civil disobedience encoded in political democracy as a legitimate response, a legitimate moral response to the failures of elected governments to carry out their appropriate roles. And so that to me is something that increasingly I feel we are seeing to some extent. We're seeing civil disobedience, and of course, when civil disobedience is a legitimate part of democracy, then it can play a role. So Extinction Rebellion, for example, has made many of the arguments that we would like to make in terms of transition. And there's a group here in the UK called Insulate Britain who glued themselves to the motorway that goes around the outskirts of London, and everybody hated them. But when I asked an energy company who was coming to insulate our house, what he thought of the policies for making these changes that the government had put in place, he said, I'll tell you one thing, the most work we ever had was when Insulate Britain glued themselves to the motorway. Civil disobedience actually had an impact which political democracy had failed to achieve. And so I do think we have to re-examine that political contract. We have to re-examine our role in relation to that political contract. And we certainly have to, in my country at the moment, the biggest danger to the ability to exercise civil disobedience is it's in the process of being made criminal, so that even the right to protest will become criminal if these things pass through government. And I think that's dangerous, not just because it suppresses civil disobedience, because it actually foments the grounds for much more drastic and potentially more violent change, because the interests of ordinary people are being overridden by the interests of elites. And so I feel as though we defend the idea of democracy in our Western economies, but actually it's at best half finished. And we actually have to go back to the project of those original political scientists and create a form of government and a form of democracy that works. And then very briefly, because I know you wanted to not go on too long, but I also pointed to a fascinating distinction in that chapter on power and post-growth, which is of two very different kinds of power. And I think they characterize very clearly the sorts of things that Yayo and I have been distinguishing a power which is seen as physical might, and goes under the logic that might is right, that the more powerful you are, the better your outcomes, and that is a legitimate response to being human in a human society. And I characterize that in the book by contrasting it with an argument about power, which is drawn from a Vietnamese monk who died recently called Thich Nhat Hanh. And he talks about power in a completely different sense. And he talks about conventional forms of power as being actually a form of addiction that leads us astray and creates suffering. And the response, in his view, is actually to turn towards suffering rather than to move away from it by creating more worldly power, to turn towards it, and that there is a kind of inner journey towards individual inner power that actually has a part to play in the change that we're looking for. And I find it a very attractive idea, a recasting of the legitimacy of power on the one hand through the right to civil disobedience, and on the other hand through a reclaiming of the idea of a form of spiritual power that actually at any moment, at any time, in any place of the world, any individual person has not just a right to, but the potential to claim.
Bueno, entro yo a contestar así algunas de las cosas.
Some of the questions that have been asked. First of all, whether there is a limit to wealth. Well, it depends on what we call wealth. If we talk about possessing, having cars, beings, cell phones, homes, whatever, anything that depends on the limits, or anything that depends on the earth resources that are limited, or if we were talking about whether we want to be rich, not having any sort of care, labor, and exploiting everyone around us, obviously that has some limits, and the limit is in the amount of kilos of fuel or oil that could be drilled, or the amount of hectares of fertile land that can be exploited, or the amount of time of people that could be exploited. And that clearly there are limits there. But if we think that wealth is living in societies where relationships are rich, and if we consider wealth having the capacity of imagining future worlds that are desirable and make them a reality now, then that is limitless. The limit is the sky. I mean, we could imagine as much as we want, and this has to do with what Tim was saying previously. When we talk about limits, it's important to be specific and say what has limits. So the duration of a human life is limited. We are beings that grow old, that can fall sick, and that can end up dying. But capitalism also asks us for our bodies to be goods that have always to be young and new, and so capitalism doesn't like death. And then there's also limit in physical resources, obviously, just to use economical terms that the land has. But in other kinds of wealth, we don't have those limits. We don't necessarily have to find limits, and they don't need to be considered in the same way. So what we have to think about post-growth societies and degrowth societies, we need to think about we need to talk about reducing the material sphere of economy. So it's not that we want to reduce it, it's just that it's going to be reduced. That is why we talk about collapse. And since it's going to be reduced whether we like it or not, then we'd better organize it so that it happens in an orderly way. And that's why we were talking about all those narratives. But about whether we have reached the end of neoliberalism, I think that probably, according to what has just been said, we might be seeing the last of the long flight transportations and long supply chains, global supply chains, that might be true. According to the figures that we're getting, that might be the end of it. But that this model, this absolutely wasteful model that has lasted for a long time. I mean, not as long as we have been on this planet, but the fact that this is going to end does not mean that capitalism is going to end as anthropology and as a way of understanding the world. What could come after that, if we don't build those post-growth societies, could be even worse, such as the invasion of the Ukraine is actually showing us that, but many of the other conflicts that are taking place in the world in areas that historically have been used as big mines and so on could also be an example in a harsh capitalistic model where people and corporations aspire to keep on having their results grow and they do not understand the limits and the vulnerability of bodies, then we would be going to different sorts of capitalism. I remember that Ramon Fernández Durán, who left us 11 years ago, but his thoughts are still present nowadays, talked about the possibility of regional capitalism, violent capitalism, if the dynamic doesn't change. So I think that the dynamic and the capitalist anthropology and this subjectivity, capitalistic subjectivity, is not going to fall on its own. We have to change it with these cultural changes that we were mentioning previously. Now, as for why is this perception a minority and why people don't talk about this in institutional political layers of our society, well, I think it's just a minority. Conversation is due to the lack of perception of being beings that belong to lives. There is a general perception in the Western world, not in the original peoples and other societies, but there is a generalized perception that human beings always, thanks to their science, thanks to this concept of progress, thanks to their technology, have managed to solve all of the problems they have faced. It's a society, an economy, a policy that does not understand the law of entropy, does not understand that there are processes that are irreversible and that there are certain things that when degraded, they have no solution, they cannot be solved. And that fantasy, that imagination that everything will be solved with engineering and technology is also an element that keeps people blind. And to add to what Tim was saying previously with regards to politics and politicians, I'm not going to generalize saying that people in politics are all a certain way, because I don't know many people in politics, but I know that some people are fighting on the daily trying to transform things. But what I do think is that in general, politics right now, institutional politics have also fallen in a situation where there is a lot of generalization, and now they have fallen into the trap of votes. And in that sense, I think that politics lately, I have the feeling, at least here in Spain, I have the feeling that politics have been reduced to a problem in communication. So I think that an important part of political parties have decided to renounce to work in the neighborhoods, in the villages where we really suffer on the daily, and they are doing their politics just looking at social networks, looking at how the campaigns are unfolding, and since the dominant rationale is that of growth and progress limited to growth, well, they are very scared and they're very cautious. They don't want to say these sorts of things that could not connect well with what they think is the majority rationale that could not understand these things. So I have the same experience that Tim has mentioned. When you go to the university, when you go to a neighbor association, when you go to a women's group, when you go to a parish, and you talk and you talk to them and you show them the framework, you don't need to tell them many things. People understand what the solutions are. They quickly understand what it is that needs to be done. Obviously, they don't give you a roadmap for the ecological transition. It's not a precise way, but they know what the main lines for change are. They find them with amazing clarity. So it's not, from my point of view, so difficult to understand. And I think that there is an important challenge. We have had the case not long ago of our minister Garzón, when he talked about the industrial warehouses. Remember that the communication, you know, that the colleagues from his colleagues from government were against him, but the population, the social fabric, actually neutralized the media campaign that was starting against him, because we know that he was right, and we can now start daring to at least start ideological debates, and I think that it is very important. And now, with regards to the last topic about whether I were to wake up and be a political leader, what would I do in order to change things? Well, I probably in other spaces we have already talked about how to try and reconfigure the food system and housing and so on. But the first thing that I would do would be to start an important campaign that would not just ask for people to reason, but also I would try to tune in with feelings, with values, so that people understand that we are sharing our fate with everything else within this planet. Human life is not viable if we don't face what is staring us in the face, and we have to do it jointly with everyone else. We cannot leave anyone behind. We need to tackle the debates. We need to put those topics on the table in a clear way. I think it is urgent. That is what boys and girls in Fridays for Future have done it when they took the streets and they started naming those things that adult frightened societies didn't want to mention. And if boys and girls, if the younger people have done it, then I think that at least we should be able to back them up and take the streets with them and do that disobedience, that civil disobedience movement to fight for that. And I'm going to ask for a very, very short intervention because we're very, very late, only 30 seconds each. So you can go back, you can go travel into the future, 100 years. What would you like to see in 100 years' time if you were to travel to the future? Well, I would like to see, I imagine a community where people have a different notion of what work is. They invest time in guaranteeing what needs to be guaranteed for sustenance, but they have lots of time to work as a community. I would love to see a society that is joyful, a society that is equalitarian, that is not based on dominion, and I would love to see a society that lives mainly following three principles: sufficiency, learning to live with what is enough as a right and as a duty, to only have what's enough, in a society that is based on a good distribution of rights and duties, and a society that is organized by the logic of care. That is what I would like to see. And now, Tim, what would you like to see in 100 years' time?
I think Yayo's given us a very, very good sketch. I think one of the things that I feel, in some sense, is the biggest failure of capitalism is that it sold us a very poor vision of what it means to be human. And so I guess in 100 years' time, I would like to see us having reclaimed that vision. And of course, that is to some extent incumbent on having a society which is organized very much as Yayo's described it, where we have material sufficiency, where we see equality, where our communities are strong, But I would also like to see, I'd like to return to an idea of human progress that is really at its core is about fulfillment of our potential as social beings and as individuals and as communities. And I think we have given that away, that idea, to a dream of materialism that is always going to fail us. And in order to reclaim it, we have to give away materialism. We have to do that task of understanding the limits of the material world in order to achieve this potentially unlimited fulfillment that I think human beings are capable of.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Con estas reflexiones tenemos que poner punto y final.
To finish now. So thank you so much to La Casa Encendida for organizing this. Thank you so much to Transición Verde for collaborating and for being part of this cultural battle to end certain myths. So we hope we can advance, and I will leave this meeting with the idea that any transition, any new model needs to reconnect us with the earth and the planet. And thank you all so much for participating. And I just wanted to tell you that the video of this this talk, as well as the previous ones, will be soon available at La Casa Encendida's YouTube channel. Thank you so much.